Welcome back to her journey, beautiful souls. I'm your host, and today we have Anna Benjamin sharing a story that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about power, respect, and the art of perfect revenge. If you're new here, we share real stories from real women who faced life's greatest challenges and found their strength in the most unexpected ways. Don't just listen and leave. Hit subscribe so you'll never miss another story that speaks to your soul. Ring that notification bell because Anna's journey is about to take you on a ride you'll never forget. Now, let's dive into a tale of quiet dignity meeting explosive consequences. My name is Anna Benjamin, and I want to tell you about the morning that changed everything between my daughter-in-law and me forever. The sun was just beginning to paint the sky in soft pastels over Marina del Rey, and the water was so still it looked like polished glass. At 58, I've learned to appreciate these quiet moments before the world wakes up and demands its due. There's something sacred about dawn on the water, something that speaks to the soul in ways that words never could. I was alone on the deck of my yacht, the Serenity, running a mop across the teak decking with slow, deliberate strokes. The wood gleamed under my care, each plank reflecting the morning light like liquid amber. I could have called the crew. Lord knows I pay them well enough. But there's something deeply satisfying about tending to your own things, about the meditation that comes with honest work. People often ask me why I clean my own yacht when I could afford a dozen people to do it for me. The answer is simple. This vessel isn't just an asset or a status symbol. It's my sanctuary, my refuge from a world that constantly wants to categorize and diminish me. When I clean her decks, when I polish her brass fittings, when I tend to every detail myself, I'm not just maintaining a boat. I'm honoring the journey that brought me here. You see, I wasn't born into wealth. I was born Anna Marie Kowalski in a Polish neighborhood in Detroit, where my father worked double shifts at the Ford plant and my mother took in sewing to make ends meet. I learned early that nothing in this world comes free, that respect is earned through action, not inheritance, and that the most valuable things in life are the ones you build with your own hands. I met my late husband, Benjamin, when I was 23 and working as a secretary at his law firm. He was 15 years older, established, brilliant, and kind in ways that made my heart skip beats. People whispered, of course, they always do when a working-class girl catches the eye of a successful man. They said I was a gold digger, that I was using him for his money, that I couldn't possibly love him for who he was. They were wrong about everything except one thing. Benjamin did change my life, but not in the way they thought. He taught me about investments, about real estate, about building wealth that would last generations. More importantly, he saw something in me that I hadn't seen in myself, a sharp mind for business, an intuitive understanding of people and markets, and a patience that could outlast anyone's attempts to underestimate me. When Benjamin died 6 years ago, I inherited his law practice, his investment portfolio, and his real estate holdings. But I also inherited something more valuable, the knowledge and confidence to grow that wealth into something even he couldn't have imagined. Today, my net worth sits comfortably in the 8-figure range, built through careful investments, strategic property acquisitions, and a series of business ventures that turned my late husband's comfortable success into generational wealth. But standing on my yacht that morning, running a mop across decks that cost more than most people's houses, I looked exactly like what I was, a woman taking care of her own things in her own way. The sound of heels clicking against the deck interrupted my peaceful morning ritual. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. Only one person in my family would wear stilettos on a yacht at 7 in the morning.
Victoria.
My son Marcus's wife of 3 years, 28 years old, blonde, beautiful, and possessed of the kind of entitlement that comes from being told you're special your entire life without ever having to prove it. She was holding a champagne flute filled with what looked like a mimosa, her perfectly manicured nails catching the morning light as she gestured dismissively in my direction. Victoria had that look on her face, the one she always wore when she looked at me. It was a mixture of disgust and pity, as if she was observing something distasteful that she was forced to tolerate for the sake of politeness. Her eyes swept over me with the kind of look people give to a stain on white linen, taking in my simple work clothes, my pulled-back hair, my hands that showed the evidence of honest labor. She tilted her head and smiled, not a warm smile, not even a polite smile, but the kind of cold, superior smile that people use when they want to put someone in their place. "Cleaning ladies have no place here," she said, her voice dripping with a kind of casual cruelty that she had perfected over our 3 years of acquaintance. I stopped mopping. The morning suddenly felt different, charged with an electricity that hadn't been there moments before. I leaned on the mop handle and looked at her directly, not blinking, not looking away, not showing even a hint of the embarrassment or shame she clearly expected to see. "This is my yacht," I said quietly. For the first time since I had known Victoria, she froze. The champagne glass stopped halfway to her lips. Her confident smile faltered and then disappeared entirely. I held her gaze for a moment longer than was polite, letting the weight of her mistake settle between us like a stone dropping into still water. Then I went back to mopping as if she had said nothing at all. But something had shifted in that moment. Something sharp and crystalline had settled into place in my mind, like tumblers falling into position in a very expensive lock. Victoria had just shown me exactly who she thought I was and exactly who she thought she was. More importantly, she had given me something precious, complete clarity about what needed to happen next. I continued cleaning my yacht as the sun climbed higher, and Victoria retreated to whatever corner of my vessel she felt entitled to occupy. But the morning calm was gone, replaced by something much more dangerous. I was no longer just Anna Benjamin, the woman who cleaned her own yacht. I was Anna Benjamin, the woman who was about to teach someone a very expensive lesson about respect. Before we continue with Anna's incredible story, I want to remind you that your voice matters too. If you've ever been underestimated or dismissed because of how you look or what you choose to do, you're not alone. Hit that like button if Anna's quiet dignity is resonating with you, and share this video with someone who needs to hear that true power doesn't announce itself. It simply is. Now, let's see how Anna begins to respond to Victoria's challenge. That evening, we hosted what Victoria liked to call an intimate gathering on board the Serenity. In Victoria's world, intimate meant 40 of her closest friends, 3 bartenders, a string quartet, and enough champagne to float a smaller boat. I watched from the upper deck as she orchestrated the evening like a conductor leading a symphony of social climbing. She had changed into a flowing white dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries, her hair swept up in an elaborate arrangement that had required 2 hours and a team of stylists. Every gesture was calculated, every laugh was performed, every conversation was an opportunity to demonstrate her importance to anyone within earshot. Victoria was in her element, flitting from group to group like a beautiful butterfly collecting nectar from the admiration of others. She regaled her audience with stories about her latest charity luncheon, though I happened to know she had donated exactly nothing to the cause. She dropped names of celebrities she had supposedly met at various galas, though her meetings had consisted of standing in the same room and taking selfies from across the crowd. She discussed her connections in the art world with the authority of someone who had bought exactly 3 pieces from a gallery that specialized in selling to people who confused expense with taste. But it was the subtle jabs at me that truly revealed her artistry. "Anna is so wonderfully authentic," she would say with that perfectly practiced laugh. "She probably doesn't understand how these modern galas work, bless her heart. She's from a different generation, you know." Or, "Oh, Anna has such old-fashioned tastes. I keep trying to help her modernize her style, but you know how set in their ways older women can become." Each comment was delivered with that innocent smile, that tone of voice that could be interpreted as affectionate concern by anyone who wasn't listening carefully. But I was listening very carefully indeed. Victoria had perfected the art of the velvet insult, cruelty wrapped in kindness, dismissal disguised as fondness. She could make me invisible while standing right in front of her guests, could diminish my worth while appearing to defend me, could establish her superiority while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. It was, I had to admit, quite impressive. I let her perform. I smiled when she introduced me to her friends as Marcus's mother. She's such a character. I nodded politely when she explained my absence from various social events as being due to my preferring quiet evenings at home. I even thanked her when she complimented my practical outfit, a simple black dress that cost more than her car but looked understated enough to support her narrative about my lack of sophistication. There's a certain advantage to letting someone believe they've already won. They stop looking over their shoulder. They stop guarding their flank. They become comfortable, confident, careless. As I sipped my wine and observed Victoria's performance, I thought about something my late husband had taught me during his years as a litigator. The most dangerous opponent is the one who lets you think you're winning right up until the moment you realize you've lost everything. Victoria's friends were impressed by the yacht, of course. They took selfies against the backdrop of the marina, posted Instagram stories about the amazing evening they were having, and made sure to tag Victoria in every photo as if she were the hostess rather than a guest on someone else's vessel. Not one of them asked who owned the boat. Not one of them questioned why we were entertaining on my yacht if Victoria was supposedly the one with the social connections and the lifestyle worth envying. They simply accepted the reality she presented to them. That she was important, that she belonged in luxury, that she was the kind of person who naturally found herself in these elevated circumstances. I watched it all with the detached fascination of an anthropologist studying a particularly interesting tribal ritual. Victoria had created an entire mythology around herself, and her friends were eager participants in maintaining that illusion because it reflected well on them to be associated with someone so apparently successful. But mythologies are fragile things. They require constant maintenance, constant reinforcement, constant vigilance to keep the cracks from showing. And I was about to become very interested in finding those cracks. As the evening wound down and Victoria's friends began to depart, air-kissing and promising to do lunch soon, I began asking my son small, seemingly innocent questions. "Darling," I said to Marcus as he helped the catering staff clean up, "have you checked your joint accounts lately?" Marcus looked up from the champagne flutes he was collecting. "Why would you ask that, Mom?" "Oh, no particular reason. Just that storms rarely announce themselves, and it's always wise to keep an eye on the horizon." He laughed, dismissing my concern with the casual confidence of a man who had never had to worry about money. "Victoria handles all of our social expenses. She's much better at that kind of thing than I am." "I'm sure she is," I said quietly. As the last guests departed and Victoria retreated to the master cabin to remove her performance costume, I remained on deck, looking out at the lights of the marina twinkling like stars reflected in dark water. Tomorrow, I would begin having quiet conversations with lawyers and advisors. I would start restructuring things, moving assets, making sure that what was mine stayed mine, and that what Victoria thought was hers would turn out to be something else entirely. She didn't notice a thing that night, too intoxicated by her own performance to see the audience of one who had been taking notes the entire time. Victoria believed she had shown me my place. What she had actually done was show me exactly where she was most vulnerable. And I intended to use that information very, very carefully. Over the following weeks, I became a student of Victoria's world with the dedication of a scholar pursuing a PhD in human nature. I discovered that watching someone who believes they're invisible to you reveals truths that no amount of direct questioning could ever uncover. Victoria's days followed a predictable pattern, choreographed around maintaining the illusion of effortless sophistication. She would wake at 10, spend an hour on what she called her beauty routine, though I noticed the products were increasingly purchased from department stores rather than the high-end boutiques she used to favor. She would then spend another hour curating her social media presence, selecting photos that had been taken weeks or even months earlier to create the impression of a constantly exciting lifestyle. I began to notice things she thought no one saw. The way she would check her reflection in every surface she passed, not out of vanity, but out of anxiety, as if she was constantly afraid that her mask might slip. The stack of shopping bags she would hide in the back of her walk-in closet, tags still attached to clothes she couldn't afford to actually wear but needed to photograph for her Instagram account before returning them. The subtle tension that would cross her face whenever Marcus mentioned finances, budgets, or any topic that might require her to account for her spending. But most telling was her constant need for her friends to see her, to witness her existence, to validate her importance through their attention. Victoria couldn't simply enjoy a moment. She had to document it, share it, transform it into content that would feed the hungry beast of her public image. I watched her spend 20 minutes staging the perfect photo of a breakfast she wouldn't eat, a book she wouldn't read, and a view she wouldn't appreciate because she was too busy calculating the optimal lighting and angles to capture it. I observed her craft captions that told elaborate stories about her spontaneous adventures, her unexpected encounters with celebrities, her natural moments of joy that had required multiple takes and professional-level editing to achieve. The performance was exhausting, and I could see the toll it was taking on her. There were moments when she thought no one was looking, brief intervals between one act and the next, when her face would collapse into something approaching desperation. She was running faster and faster on a treadmill of her own creation, and the only way to avoid falling was to keep accelerating. I began asking Marcus more pointed questions during our weekly dinners, always framed as motherly concern rather than investigative inquiry. "How are you feeling about your financial situation, sweetheart? You seem stressed lately." Victoria's been talking about some big expenses coming up, new art pieces, a renovation project for the house. Have you two discussed a budget for these things? I noticed Victoria's been shopping quite a bit lately. Is everything all right with your cash flow? Marcus's responses revealed exactly what I had suspected. He had no idea how much money his wife was spending, no understanding of where their money was going, and no real awareness of their actual financial position. Victoria had created a beautiful bubble of ignorance around him, managing their accounts in such a way that he saw only what she wanted him to see. But I had resources that Victoria didn't know about, connections she couldn't imagine, and the kind of quiet influence that comes from decades of careful relationship building in both business and social circles. I started having discreet conversations with my financial advisors, my attorneys, and my accountants. Not about anything dramatic or obvious, just small adjustments, minor restructuring, the kind of routine maintenance that wealthy families do to protect their assets and optimize their tax situations. I moved some properties from one holding company to another. I adjusted the terms of certain trusts. I modified the ownership structure of a few investments that Marcus had always assumed would eventually be his. None of it was illegal or unethical. All of it was perfectly within my rights as the owner of these assets. But the cumulative effect would be to create a very different financial landscape than the one Victoria was counting on. I also began to pay closer attention to Victoria's social ecosystem, the boutiques where she shopped, the restaurants where she dined, the salons where she maintained her appearance, the galleries where she pretended to be a serious collector. What I discovered was fascinating. Victoria's entire lifestyle was built on credit, relationships, and reputation. She was paying premium prices for the privilege of being seen in the right places, buying access to exclusive circles, and maintaining an image that required constant financial input to sustain. But reputation is a fragile commodity, and access is often more dependent on personal relationships than most people realize. The boutique owners who held her dresses, the restaurant managers who saved her favorite tables, the salon stylists who accommodated her last-minute appointments. They all did these things not because Victoria was particularly important, but because she had cultivated relationships based on the assumption of continued patronage and prompt payment. I began to wonder what would happen if those assumptions proved incorrect. As I conducted my research, I maintained the same quiet, understated presence that had always defined me. I attended Victoria's events when invited, smiled at her subtle insults, and played the role of the older woman who was grateful to be included in such sophisticated company. But inside, I was building something much more complex and beautiful than Victoria could imagine. I was constructing what I came to think of as the velvet guillotine, an instrument of justice so elegant and precise that its victim wouldn't feel the blade until it was far too late to avoid the consequences. Victoria had spent 3 years teaching me exactly who she was and exactly what she valued. Now, I was going to use that education to show her exactly who I was and exactly what I was capable of. The game had begun, though only one of us knew we were playing. Anna's strategic mind is absolutely fascinating, isn't it? The way she's quietly gathering intelligence while Victoria remains completely oblivious to the storm that's brewing. If you're loving this methodical approach to justice, make sure you're subscribed because Anna's plan is about to shift into high gear. Hit that notification bell and share this video with someone who appreciates the art of patience. Now, let's see how Anna begins to close the gates around Victoria's perfect world. Victoria's world, I realized, was built on exclusivity. She thrived on being part of clubs, boutiques, restaurants, and social circles that ordinary people couldn't access. Her identity was constructed around the word membership. She belonged to places and groups that made her feel special, chosen, superior to the masses who could only dream of such privileges. This exclusivity wasn't just about luxury, it was about psychology. Victoria needed to feel that she was on the inside of things that others were locked out of. She needed the velvet ropes, the private entrances, the unlisted phone numbers, the personal shopping appointments. These weren't just amenities to her. They were validation, proof of her importance in a world that might otherwise ignore her completely. So, naturally, that's where I decided to begin. Over the course of several months, I started making very quiet, very strategic investments. Not in stocks or bonds or traditional assets, but in the infrastructure of Victoria's lifestyle. I bought things that most people don't realize can be bought: influence, access, and ultimately, the power to grant or deny the very exclusivity that Victoria had built her identity around. The first acquisition was Bella Vista, the boutique where Victoria did most of her shopping. It was a small but prestigious shop in Beverly Hills that specialized in European designers and limited edition pieces. The owner, Elena Marchetti, was an elegant Italian woman in her 60s who had built her business on personal relationships and discretionary service. She knew her clients' measurements, their preferences, their budgets, and most importantly, their social calendars. Elena had been struggling financially since the pandemic, though she maintained appearances beautifully. Her clientele was shrinking, her overhead was astronomical, and she was considering either selling or closing entirely. I approached her through my business manager with a proposition. I would become a silent partner, providing the capital injection she needed to modernize and expand, in exchange for a controlling interest in the business. Elena was grateful for the lifeline, and I was careful to structure the deal in such a way that she retained operational control while I held ultimate authority over membership policies and client relationships. To the outside world, nothing had changed. Elena still ran her boutique with the same impeccable taste and personal attention. But now, every decision about who received priority service, who got access to exclusive pieces, and who remained in good standing was ultimately subject to my approval. The same process was repeated with Serenity Spa, where Victoria received her weekly treatments and maintained the flawless appearance that her Instagram presence required. The spa was owned by a lovely woman named Carol Chin who had invested everything into creating a sanctuary of luxury and wellness, but was drowning in debt from overexpansion and high-end equipment purchases. Again, I became a silent partner, providing the financial stability Carol desperately needed while gaining quiet influence over policies and priorities. Carol was so relieved to save her business that she never questioned why a woman she'd never met was willing to invest such a substantial amount with so few conditions. Then came Galleria Luna, the art gallery where Victoria had begun positioning herself as a serious collector. The owner, David Luna, was a former artist who had transitioned into dealing when his own work failed to find a market. He specialized in emerging artists and contemporary pieces that appealed to nouveau riche clients who wanted to appear sophisticated but lacked the knowledge to navigate more established art markets. David's gallery was bleeding money. He had excellent taste but terrible business sense, and he was on the verge of bankruptcy when my representatives approached him with an offer to restructure his debts and provide operating capital in exchange for partnership in the business. Within 6 months, I had acquired significant influence over the 3 businesses that formed the foundation of Victoria's social identity. But I didn't exercise that influence immediately. Instead, I waited, watching, learning the rhythms of Victoria's life and the patterns of her dependencies. During this time, I maintained my role as the quiet, unassuming mother-in-law who was grateful to be included in Victoria's sophisticated world. I attended her dinner parties, admired her new acquisitions, and listened to her stories about her connections and adventures. But now I was listening with a different kind of attention, cataloging not just her boasts but her vulnerabilities, her insecurities, her desperate need for external validation. The first small change came at Bella Vista. Elena mentioned to Victoria that they were reviewing their client services protocols and that some of the accommodations they had previously offered, like holding dresses for extended periods or providing unlimited alteration services, would need to be adjusted to reflect current business realities. Victoria was annoyed but not alarmed. These things happened in retail. She adapted by purchasing items more quickly and being more decisive about her choices. The second adjustment came at Serenity Spa. Carol informed her regular clients that due to increased demand and operational changes, the spa would be implementing a new membership structure. Existing clients would need to requalify for certain premium services, and some of the exclusive treatments Victoria had come to expect would now have limited availability. Again, Victoria was frustrated but attributed the changes to business pressures and market forces. She began booking appointments further in advance and accepting alternative time slots when her preferred appointments weren't available. The third shift occurred at Galleria Luna. David mentioned that the gallery was refining its collector relationships and that access to previews, private showings, and first-look opportunities would be prioritized based on purchase history and commitment levels. By now, Victoria was beginning to sense a pattern, but she couldn't identify the source of these coincidental changes in her access to the luxury services she had come to depend on. She complained to Marcus about how difficult everything has become lately and how these businesses don't seem to value loyalty anymore. But the changes were subtle enough, gradual enough, and spread across enough different venues that she never suspected they might be coordinated. She assumed she was experiencing the general degradation of customer service that seemed to be affecting everyone these days. What Victoria didn't realize was that I was conducting a very sophisticated experiment in social psychology. I was testing the hypothesis that her entire sense of self was dependent on external validation from businesses and institutions that could be influenced, controlled, or redirected by someone with sufficient resources and patience. The results were exceeding my expectations. As Victoria's privileged access to her favorite places began to erode, so did her confidence. She started second-guessing her choices, becoming more anxious about her appearance, and spending more time and money trying to maintain the same level of luxury experience she had previously taken for granted. The walls were moving in around her perfect world, and she could feel the pressure even though she couldn't see the mechanism that was creating it. But this was just the foundation. The real construction project was about to begin. By the time Victoria decided to throw her summer gala, I had been laying groundwork for 8 months. She announced the event with the kind of breathless excitement that suggested this party would be her crowning social achievement, a chance to cement her position as a fixture in Los Angeles high society and demonstrate once and for all that she belonged among the city's cultural elite. She spent weeks planning every detail with the obsessive precision of a military campaign. The venue would be the penthouse ballroom at the Meridian Hotel, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights. The theme would be Midnight in Monte Carlo, complete with casino tables, a champagne fountain, and live jazz music. The dress code would be black tie optional, which in Victoria's circles meant that black tie was absolutely mandatory. Most importantly, the guest list would be her masterpiece, a carefully curated collection of influencers, business leaders, social media personalities, and cultural figures who would transform her party from a simple gathering into a legitimate social event worthy of coverage in the lifestyle magazines she desperately wanted to be featured in. Victoria had been working on this guest list for months, leveraging every connection she had ever made, calling in every favor she had ever earned, and extending invitations to people who barely knew her but might attend if the event seemed prestigious enough. She was particularly proud of securing commitments from several local celebrities, a handful of successful entrepreneurs, and the wives of men who appeared regularly in the business journals. What Victoria didn't know was that I had been having my own conversations with many of the same people. It started with casual encounters at the country club, where I had been a member for 15 years. I would mention Victoria's upcoming gala to acquaintances, always framing it positively, but with just enough subtle concern to plant seeds of doubt. "Oh, you're going to Victoria's party? How wonderful! I hope she's not overextending herself with such an ambitious event. These things can be so expensive, and Marcus has been looking a bit stressed about finances lately." Or, "Victoria's party sounds lovely, though I have to wonder if the timing is right. There have been some changes in their circumstances lately that might make such a large expense complicated." I never said anything explicitly negative about Victoria or the event. I simply expressed the kind of gentle concern that one might have for a family member who is making questionable decisions. But in social circles where reputation and financial stability are paramount concerns, even gentle doubts can spread like ripples across still water. I also began having more direct conversations with some of the key attendees, people I had known for years through various business and charitable connections. These weren't manipulative or deceptive discussions, but rather honest conversations about family dynamics and personal concerns. "I'm worried about my daughter-in-law," I would confide to friends who had known me long enough to trust my judgment. "She's been spending quite extravagantly lately, and I'm not sure Marcus fully understands their financial situation. This party she's planning seems like it might be beyond their means, but she's so invested in maintaining appearances that I don't think she'll listen to reason." The effect was subtle but powerful. People began to view Victoria's gala not as a celebration of success, but as a potential warning sign of financial overextension. The very ambition that Victoria thought would impress her guests instead began to concern them. But I didn't stop at planting doubts. I also began creating competing opportunities for the same evening. Through my various business and charitable connections, I quietly arranged for several alternative events to be scheduled for the same night as Victoria's gala. A private art opening at a gallery I had recently begun supporting. A charity fundraiser for a cause that was particularly popular among the social set Victoria was trying to impress. An intimate dinner party hosted by a well-established family whose invitations were considered highly desirable. None of these events were positioned as competition to Victoria's party. They were simply other options, other opportunities, other places where the same people might choose to spend their evening. As the date of the gala approached, Victoria began receiving regrets. Not a flood of cancellations, which would have been obvious and traceable, but a steady stream of apologies from people who had just discovered conflicting commitments, who had completely forgotten about prior obligations, who were so disappointed to miss what would surely be a wonderful event. Each cancellation was perfectly reasonable and completely understandable. Each person who declined offered legitimate reasons and sincere apologies. But the cumulative effect was devastating to Victoria's carefully planned evening. The night of the gala arrived with all the pomp and circumstance Victoria had envisioned. The ballroom was decorated beautifully, the champagne fountain sparkled under crystal chandeliers, and the jazz trio created the perfect ambient atmosphere for sophisticated conversation. Victoria herself looked stunning in a black Valentino gown that had cost more than many people's cars. But the room was half empty. Where Victoria had planned for 200 guests, perhaps 90 people actually attended. The carefully curated mix of celebrities, business leaders, and social influencers had been reduced to a handful of diehard supporters, some business associates who couldn't politely decline, and a smattering of people who had nothing better to do on a Saturday evening. I watched from my table near the back of the room as Victoria moved through the evening with increasingly desperate energy, trying to animate conversations that fell flat, posing for photographs with people who looked uncomfortable, and maintaining her brilliant smile, even as the reality of her situation became undeniable. The jazz trio played to a room that never filled. The champagne fountain bubbled cheerfully, while bottles remained unopened. The casino tables sat largely unused, their dealers looking bored and restless. But the most painful moment came when Victoria took the microphone to thank her guests and officially welcome them to her little gathering. She had clearly prepared remarks for a much larger audience, references to the amazing turnout and incredible support that sounded hollow in the sparsely populated ballroom. I felt a moment of something that might have been pity as I watched her struggle through her speech, trying to project confidence and gratitude while her eyes swept across the empty tables and vacant spaces where her triumph should have been. But then I remembered the morning on my yacht, the casual cruelty in her voice when she had dismissed me as nothing more than hired help. I remembered the months of subtle insults, the constant implications that I was somehow less worthy of respect because I didn't perform my wealth the way she performed hers. Pity evaporated, replaced by the cold satisfaction of watching someone learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between respect and fear, between genuine influence and purchased access. As the evening wound down and the remaining guests began to make their excuses, Victoria found herself standing in the middle of her beautiful, empty ballroom, surrounded by the remnants of her perfect party. "Everything all right, dear?" I asked her, my voice gentle with just the right touch of motherly concern. "It's nothing," she replied, but her voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. "Good," I said quietly. "I'd hate to see you unsettled." The look she gave me in that moment suggested that she was beginning to suspect something, though she couldn't yet imagine the scope of what was actually happening to her carefully constructed world. But suspicion without proof is just paranoia, and Victoria was about to learn that paranoia can be almost as destructive as actual persecution. The gala scene is absolutely devastating, isn't it? Victoria's humiliation is so perfectly orchestrated, so complete, and Anna delivers it all with such quiet elegance. If you're feeling that satisfying sense of justice right now, smash that like button and share this video with someone who appreciates the art of strategic patience. Anna's plan is far from over. We're just getting to the truly masterful part. Stay tuned. The weeks following the failed gala marked the beginning of Victoria's visible decline, though she fought valiantly to maintain her facade of success and sophistication. The party's sparse attendance had been noticed by everyone who mattered in her social circle, and in a world where perception is reality, failure is contagious. The first domino to fall was her inclusion in the social events she had spent years cultivating access to. Invitations that had once arrived regularly began to dry up. The charity luncheons, gallery openings, and private dinner parties that had formed the backbone of her social calendar suddenly found reasons not to include her on their guest lists. When Victoria reached out to friends to ask about events she heard about through social media, she was met with vague explanations about limited space and different themes this year that left her feeling confused and increasingly paranoid. The same people who had been eager to attend her parties when she was riding high were now mysteriously unavailable when she needed their support. But the social isolation was just the beginning. The real damage was happening to the infrastructure of her daily life, the carefully cultivated relationships with service providers that had made her feel special and important. At Bella Vista, Elena began implementing the new client service protocols with increasing strictness. Victoria would arrive for her usual shopping appointments only to find that the dresses she had been promised were no longer available, sold to other clients who had acted more quickly on their decisions. The alterations that had once been complimentary now carried premium charges. The personal styling sessions that had made her feel like royalty were temporarily suspended due to staffing changes. Victoria complained, of course, but Elena's responses were always professionally polite and completely reasonable. Business conditions had changed, she explained. Client demands had evolved. The boutique was simply adapting to new realities in the luxury retail market. At Serenity Spa, Carol was implementing similar changes with the same reasonable explanations. Victoria's usual appointment times were no longer available due to increased demand. The exclusive treatments she had come to depend on were under review for quality assurance purposes. Her requests for last-minute bookings were met with apologies about full schedules and waiting lists. Meanwhile, at Galleria Luna, David was becoming increasingly unavailable for the private consultations that had made Victoria feel like a serious art collector. The pieces she expressed interest in were somehow always under consideration by other collectors, or part of a collection that's not being broken up. The preview events she had once been automatically invited to were now by special invitation only, invitations that somehow never arrived. Each individual change was perfectly reasonable and completely defensible. But the cumulative effect was the systematic dismantling of everything that had made Victoria feel special, chosen, and important. I watched this process unfold with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a carefully controlled experiment. Victoria was losing more than just access to luxury services. She was losing her sense of identity, her confidence, her belief in her own importance. Without the external validation she had become addicted to, she was beginning to question everything about herself and her place in the world. The psychological impact became visible in her appearance and behavior. The woman who had once glided through social situations with supreme confidence now seemed anxious and uncertain. She spent more time checking her reflection, more money on her appearance, more energy trying to maintain the same level of luxury experience she had previously taken for granted. Her relationship with Marcus began to show strain as well. He couldn't understand why she seemed so stressed about what appeared to be minor inconveniences with service providers. When she tried to explain that something was systematically wrong, that all of these changes couldn't be coincidental, she sounded paranoid and irrational. "Maybe you just need to find new places," Marcus would suggest with the casual dismissiveness of someone who had never had to worry about access or acceptance. There are plenty of other boutiques and spas in the city. But Victoria knew something Marcus didn't understand. In her world, it wasn't just about finding alternatives. It was about belonging to the right places, being recognized by the right people, maintaining relationships that confirmed her status and importance. Starting over with new service providers meant starting over with her entire identity. The breaking point came when Victoria received a call from Carol at Serenity Spa informing her that her membership was being discontinued due to policy changes and capacity limitations. The spa would no longer be able to accommodate her appointments, effective immediately. Victoria was devastated. Serenity Spa hadn't just been where she maintained her appearance, it had been her sanctuary, the place where she felt most pampered and valued. The loss felt personal, inexplicable, and deeply threatening to her sense of self. She called Elena at Bella Vista to vent her frustrations, only to be told that the boutique was also reviewing its client relationships and that Victoria's account had been flagged for evaluation. Elena couldn't provide specifics about what that meant, but she suggested that Victoria might want to explore other shopping options while the review was ongoing. Finally, David from Galleria Luna left a voicemail explaining that the gallery was restructuring its collector services and that Victoria would no longer receive priority access to new acquisitions or private events. He thanked her for her past interest in the gallery and wished her well in her future collecting endeavors. Within the span of a single week, Victoria had lost access to all three businesses that had formed the foundation of her social identity. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental, the explanations too similar to be unrelated. For the first time, she began to seriously consider the possibility that someone was orchestrating her downfall. But who would have both the motivation and the resources to mount such a sophisticated campaign against her? She had made enemies, certainly. No one climbs as aggressively as Victoria had without stepping on some people along the way. But this level of coordination, this depth of infiltration into her personal life, suggested someone with access to information and influence that most of her rivals simply didn't possess. The answer, when it finally occurred to her, was so obvious that she couldn't believe she hadn't seen it sooner. Anna. The quiet, understated mother-in-law who had always seemed so grateful to be included in Victoria's sophisticated world. The woman who cleaned her own yacht and wore simple clothes and appeared to have no interest in the social games that defined Victoria's existence. But appearances, Victoria was beginning to realize, could be deceiving. And the woman she had dismissed as irrelevant might be the most dangerous opponent she had ever faced. The problem was proving it. Anna had been so careful, so subtle, so perfectly reasonable in all of her interactions that Victoria couldn't point to a single action or statement that could be interpreted as hostile. If Anna was indeed responsible for Victoria's recent troubles, she had orchestrated them with a level of sophistication that left no fingerprints, no evidence, no trail that could be followed back to her. Victoria was trapped in a nightmare of her own making, facing an enemy she couldn't identify using weapons she couldn't see, fighting a war she was losing without ever officially acknowledging that a war was being fought. And the worst part was that she was starting to suspect this was only the beginning. Marcus finally confronted Victoria about their finances on a Tuesday evening in September, 6 months after her failed gala and 3 months after she had lost access to the luxury services that had defined her daily life. I wasn't present for the conversation, but I heard about it in excruciating detail later that evening when Marcus called me, his voice tight with anxiety and barely controlled anger. He had finally done what I had been gently suggesting for months. He had taken a comprehensive look at their joint accounts, credit statements, and financial obligations. What he discovered was devastating. Victoria had been spending at nearly twice the rate of Marcus's income for the better part of 2 years. The difference had been made up through credit cards, personal loans, and a series of increasingly creative financial arrangements that had kept the truth hidden from Marcus, while creating a mountain of debt that would take years to resolve. The failed gala alone had cost them nearly $60,000, money they didn't have, charged to credit cards that were already approaching their limits. The designer clothes, the spa treatments, the art purchases, the expensive dinners and lavish gifts for friends, all of it had been financed through borrowed money and deferred payments that were now coming due. But perhaps most shocking to Marcus was the discovery that Victoria had been using his name and credit to secure many of these loans and credit lines without his knowledge or consent. She had forged his signature on applications, used his business credentials to qualify for financing, and leveraged his reputation to gain access to credit that their actual financial situation couldn't support. She's been living a completely fictional life, Marcus told me that night, his voice hollow with disbelief. Everything, the clothes, the parties, the art, the lifestyle, none of it was real. It was all borrowed money and fake credit. The confrontation, according to Marcus, had been ugly. Victoria had initially tried to deny everything, then to minimize the extent of the problem, then to blame external factors for their financial difficulties. She had accused Marcus of not supporting her social aspirations, of being jealous of her success, of failing to understand the investments she was making in their future social status. But the numbers were undeniable. They were facing bankruptcy if immediate action wasn't taken to address their debt load and eliminate their excessive spending. Marcus had already consulted with a financial advisor and a bankruptcy attorney, both of whom had painted a grim picture of their options going forward. "I've been so stupid," Marcus said, and I could hear him crying softly on the other end of the line. I trusted her completely. I let her handle everything because she seemed so confident, so knowledgeable about these things. I never imagined she was destroying our financial future. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when Marcus would finally see Victoria clearly, without the filters of love and trust that had blinded him to her true nature. But I took no pleasure in his pain. Whatever Victoria had done, whatever she deserved, Marcus was my son, and his suffering hurt me deeply. "What can I do to help?" I asked him. "I don't know, Mom. We're in such deep trouble. The house might have to be sold. My credit is ruined. My business reputation could be damaged if people find out about the forged documents. I might have to declare personal bankruptcy." "Let me make some calls," I said quietly. "There might be options we haven't considered yet." What I didn't tell Marcus was that I had been preparing for this moment for months. Through my various business entities and investment vehicles, I had been quietly positioning myself to offer solutions to exactly the kind of financial crisis that Victoria's spending had created. The next morning, I contacted my attorney and instructed him to reach out to Marcus with a proposal. I would purchase their house at fair market value, allowing them to pay off their mortgage and have some equity left over to address their debt situation. I would also offer Marcus a position in one of my companies at a salary that would allow him to rebuild his financial stability over time. There was one condition. Victoria would need to agree to a complete separation from any involvement in Marcus's financial affairs. She would have access to a reasonable allowance for personal expenses, but all major financial decisions would be subject to oversight and approval. Marcus was grateful for the lifeline, but Victoria's reaction was explosive. She accused me of orchestrating their entire financial crisis for the purpose of gaining control over their lives. She claimed that I had been systematically undermining her relationships with service providers and social contacts. She insisted that the timing of my offer was proof of my manipulation and malicious intent, all of which was absolutely true, though unprovable. "You've been planning this from the beginning," she screamed at me during what would be our final face-to-face conversation. "You never accepted me, never respected me, never thought I was good enough for your precious son. So you decided to destroy me." I looked at her calmly. This woman who had spent 3 years treating me like hired help, like an embarrassment, like someone whose feelings and dignity didn't matter. "Victoria," I said quietly, "I didn't destroy you. I simply stopped protecting you from the consequences of your own choices." "What does that mean?" "It means that for 3 years, I watched you spend money you didn't have, make promises you couldn't keep, and build a lifestyle based on credit and lies. I could have intervened at any time. I could have warned Marcus about what you were doing. I could have refused to allow you to use my yacht for your parties, my connections for your social climbing, my reputation to support your pretensions. I paused, letting the weight of that statement settle between us. Instead, I gave you enough rope to hang yourself. I let you make your own choices and face your own consequences. The only thing I did was ensure that when you finally fell, you wouldn't take my son down with you. Victoria stared at me with a mixture of hatred and dawning comprehension. For the first time, she was seeing me clearly, not as the quiet, simple woman she had dismissed, but as the formidable opponent I had always been. "You planned all of this," she whispered. "I planned to protect my family from someone who was using them," I corrected. Everything else was just allowing natural consequences to unfold. The divorce papers were filed the following week. Marcus kept the house, his business, and his relationship with me. Victoria kept the debts she had accumulated in her own name and the reputation she had earned through her own actions. She moved back to her parents' house in Phoenix. Her social media accounts went quiet, and the lifestyle she had spent years cultivating disappeared as completely as if it had never existed, which in many ways it hadn't. 6 months after Victoria left Los Angeles, I found myself in an unexpected place, standing in the marble foyer of my old friend Catherine Morrison's estate in Bel Air, attending a charity luncheon for childhood literacy. It was exactly the kind of event that Victoria would have killed to be invited to during her reign as my daughter-in-law, elegant, exclusive, and filled with the sort of influential women who could make or break social reputations with a whispered comment. I was admiring Catherine's latest art acquisition, a beautiful Monet water lily painting that had been acquired from a private estate, when I noticed something that made me pause. There was a woman in a black uniform polishing the silver serving pieces on the dining room sideboard, her head down, her movements efficient and practiced. It took me a moment to recognize her. The platinum blonde hair had been dyed back to a mousy brown and pulled into a simple ponytail. The designer clothes had been replaced by a standard domestic worker's uniform. The confident posture had given way to the hunched shoulders of someone trying to remain invisible. Victoria. She was working as domestic help at a charity event in the very social circle she had once desperately wanted to belong to. The irony was so perfect it felt almost theatrical. I watched her for several minutes, noting how carefully she avoided making eye contact with any of the guests, how she moved through her tasks with the kind of focused efficiency that comes from knowing you can't afford to make mistakes. This wasn't temporary employment or a side job. This was survival. When she finally looked up and saw me watching her, the color drained from her face completely. For a moment, we simply stared at each other across the elegant dining room, two women who understood exactly what this moment meant. I could have ignored her. I could have pretended not to recognize her. I could have allowed her to finish her work in peace and left without acknowledging the dramatic reversal of fortune that had brought us both to this moment. Instead, I walked over to where she was working. "Victoria," I said quietly, my voice neither cruel nor kind. She straightened up, still holding the silver serving spoon she had been polishing. "Mrs. Benjamin." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "How are you?" I asked, and I realized I genuinely wanted to know. She paused, struggling to find words that could encompass the magnitude of her fall from grace. "I'm surviving." I reached into my purse and pulled out a $100 bill, placing it on the table beside the silver she had been polishing. It was the same gesture she had probably seen wealthy women make countless times, a small tip for good service, acknowledgement of work well done. But between us, it carried the weight of everything that had happened, everything that had been lost, everything that had been learned. "Some debts aren't financial," I said softly, echoing words I had once thought but never spoken aloud. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away this time. "I know," she whispered. I nodded and walked away, leaving her to finish her work. Later that evening, Marcus called me as he often did to check in and share the details of his day. His life had stabilized considerably since Victoria's departure. The financial pressures had eased thanks to the restructuring we had arranged. His business was growing again, and he had started dating a lovely woman named Sarah, who was a pediatric nurse at Cedars-Sinai. "I saw something interesting today," I told him, and I described the encounter at Catherine's luncheon. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "How did you feel about seeing her like that?" It was a good question, one that deserved an honest answer. I paused, considering. I felt like justice had been served. Not the kind of justice that comes from courts or lawyers, but the kind that comes from natural consequences. Victoria spent years treating people like they were beneath her, like their feelings and dignity didn't matter. Now she's learning what it feels like to be on the other side of that equation. Do you think she's learned anything from all this? I don't know, I admitted. But I know that you have. And that's what matters to me. Marcus had indeed learned valuable lessons about trust, about financial responsibility, about the difference between love and manipulation. He was more careful now, more thoughtful about the people he allowed into his life, more appreciative of genuine relationships over superficial attractions. In the months that followed, I heard occasional updates about Victoria through the social networks that connect domestic workers throughout the city. She was working for several different families, living in a small apartment in the valley, and apparently keeping a much lower profile than she had during her years as Mrs. Marcus Benjamin. I never saw her again personally, but I sometimes wondered if she understood the full scope of what had happened to her. Did she realize that her downfall hadn't been the result of bad luck or market forces, but rather the carefully orchestrated consequence of her own actions and choices? Did she understand that the woman she had dismissed as irrelevant had been the architect of her destruction? More importantly, did she grasp that the destruction had been entirely preventable, that a simple apology, a basic acknowledgement of my worth and dignity, a moment of genuine humility might have changed everything? I suspected she did. And I suspected that knowledge would follow her for the rest of her life, a constant reminder of the price of arrogance and the danger of underestimating people who appear to have nothing left to lose. Some lessons, after all, are too expensive to forget. The image of Victoria polishing silver at the very events she once desperately wanted to attend, that's the kind of poetic justice that gives me chills. Anna's quiet dignity in that moment, offering that $100 bill not as charity, but as a statement, is absolutely masterful. If this scene hit you as hard as it hit me, make sure you're subscribed and share this video. We're almost at the end of Anna's incredible journey, but trust me, you won't want to miss how this story concludes. 3 years had passed since Victoria's departure from our lives, and I was sitting on the deck of my yacht on a morning that reminded me remarkably of the day this entire saga had begun. The water was mirror still, reflecting the early morning sky in perfect detail, and the marina was quiet except for the gentle sound of waves lapping against the hulls of neighboring boats. I was, once again, cleaning the deck of the Serenity. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because there was still something deeply satisfying about caring for my own things in my own way, about the meditation that came with honest work and the peace that came from being exactly where I belonged. The difference was that now everyone who knew me understood exactly who I was and what I was capable of. Marcus had remarried 6 months earlier to Sarah, the pediatric nurse who had captured his heart with her genuine kindness and her complete lack of interest in his family's wealth. Their wedding had been a small, elegant affair on the yacht, with 30 close friends and family members who had come to celebrate love rather than display status. Sarah was everything Victoria had pretended to be, genuinely caring, naturally sophisticated, and entirely comfortable with herself. She treated me with the kind of respect and affection that comes from recognizing someone's worth rather than their net worth. When she helped me in the galley or joined me for morning coffee on the deck, it was because she enjoyed my company, not because she was performing for an audience. The contrast with Victoria couldn't have been more stark or more illuminating. I had also grown closer to my son in ways that I hadn't expected. The crisis with Victoria had forced us to have honest conversations about family, about values, about what really mattered in life. Marcus had learned to appreciate authenticity over performance, substance over style, and genuine relationships over superficial connections. "I understand now why you never tried to stop me from marrying Victoria," he had told me recently. "You knew I had to learn these lessons for myself." He was right. I could have intervened earlier, could have revealed Victoria's true nature before she had the chance to do so much damage. But some lessons can only be learned through experience, and some truths can only be recognized when we're ready to see them clearly. Marcus was stronger now, wiser, more discerning about the people he trusted and the relationships he invested in. The pain of his experience with Victoria had been the price of that wisdom, but it was a price that had ultimately been worth paying. My business ventures had continued to thrive during these years of family drama. The boutique, spa, and gallery that I had acquired as part of my campaign against Victoria had all become profitable investments under improved management. I had used them as learning experiences in business operations while also ensuring that they served their communities better than they had under their previous ownership structures. Elena at Bella Vista had become a dear friend, someone who appreciated my business acumen while also understanding my commitment to treating all clients with dignity and respect. Carol at Serenity Spa had implemented new policies that made luxury wellness services accessible to a broader range of clients while maintaining the quality that made the business special. David at Galleria Luna had developed educational programs that helped new collectors learn about art without the intimidation factor that had previously characterized the gallery scene. All three businesses were thriving, serving their communities better, and providing good livelihoods for their employees. They had become sources of pride rather than simply tools of revenge. I had also used my experience with Victoria to become more involved in charitable work, particularly organizations that supported women who were rebuilding their lives after difficult circumstances. I never mentioned Victoria specifically, but I understood better than most people the challenges faced by women who had built their identities around external validation and material success. There was no satisfaction in Victoria's downfall, I had discovered. There was justice, certainly, and there was the peace that comes from seeing natural consequences play out appropriately. But there was no joy in watching another human being learn such expensive lessons about humility and authenticity. What I felt instead was a deep sense of contentment with my own choices and my own values. I had protected my family from someone who was using them, I had defended my own dignity against someone who was attacking it, and I had done both things without compromising my own integrity or stooping to the kind of cruelty that Victoria had specialized in. The yacht deck gleamed under my care, just as it had on that morning 3 years earlier, when Victoria had dismissed me as irrelevant. But now the gleaming would reflected not just the morning sun, but also the satisfaction of a woman who had remained true to herself throughout a very challenging test of character. I had learned something valuable about myself during those difficult years. I was much stronger than I had realized, much more capable than I had been given credit for, and much more dangerous, when threatened, than anyone had imagined. But I had also learned something more important. Strength without wisdom is just force. Capability without compassion is just manipulation, and power without purpose is just destruction. I had used my resources to protect rather than to destroy, to teach rather than to punish, to restore balance rather than to create chaos. The fact that those actions had resulted in Victoria's downfall was a consequence of her own choices, not the primary goal of my actions. As I finished cleaning the deck and settled in with my morning coffee to watch the marina come to life, I reflected on how different my life might have been if Victoria had made different choices on that first morning. If she had treated me with basic respect, if she had recognized my worth as a person rather than dismissing me as irrelevant, if she had understood that true power lies in lifting others up rather than putting them down. But she hadn't made those choices. And the consequences of the choices she had made would follow her for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, I was exactly where I wanted to be. On my own yacht, in my own time, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could give them. It was, I reflected, a very good place to be. 5 years after Victoria's morning of reckoning on my yacht, I received an unexpected phone call that would provide the final chapter to our story. I was in my study, reviewing quarterly reports from my various business interests, when my assistant informed me that someone named Victoria Hartwell was on the line, requesting to speak with me. It took me a moment to recognize the name. She had remarried, apparently, and taken her new husband's surname. "Put her through," I said, curious about what could have prompted this call after years of silence. "Mrs. Benjamin?" Her voice was different, quieter, more hesitant, stripped of the confident arrogance that had once characterized every word she spoke. "Hello, Victoria. I hope you don't mind that I called. I got your number from Marcus. I wanted to." She paused, and I could hear her taking a deep breath. "I wanted to apologize." I set down my reading glasses and gave her my full attention. "I'm listening." "I know it's been years, and I know an apology can't undo what I did or change what happened. But I needed you to know that I understand now. I understand what I did, and why everything fell apart the way it did." There was a long pause, and when she continued, her voice was thick with emotion. "I spent 3 years treating you like you were beneath me, like you were irrelevant, like you didn't matter. I was so focused on what I thought success looked like that I couldn't see the real success that was right in front of me. You had everything I was pretending to have: real wealth, real respect, real dignity, and instead of learning from you, I dismissed you." "What made you realize this?" I asked quietly. "The last 5 years," she said simply. "Working for families like the one I thought I belonged to, watching how they treat their staff, seeing myself in the women who clean their houses and serve their parties. I realized that the way I treated you was the way entitled people treat everyone they think is beneath them. And I realized that I had become exactly the kind of person I now have to smile at and say, 'Yes, ma'am,' to, even when they're treating me badly." I found myself genuinely moved by the honesty in her voice. "I also realized something else," she continued. "You never tried to destroy me. You just let me destroy myself. You gave me enough space to show everyone who I really was, and when I did, the consequences were natural. I spent years thinking you had orchestrated some elaborate revenge, but the truth is simpler than that. You just stopped enabling me to avoid the results of my own choices." "That's a very mature way to look at it," I said. "I'm remarried now," she said, "to a good man named Robert Hartwell. He's a high school teacher, and we live modestly but honestly. I work part-time at a nonprofit that helps women transition out of difficult situations, and I've learned more about real fulfillment in the last 2 years than I learned in the 30 years before that." "I'm glad to hear that, Victoria." "I truly am." "I don't expect forgiveness," she said quickly. "I don't even know if I deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I'm grateful for what happened, even though it was painful at the time. I needed to learn who I was when I didn't have other people's money to spend or other people's achievements to claim. I needed to discover what I was actually worth as a person." "And what did you discover?" "That I'm worth more than I thought, but for completely different reasons than I expected." Her voice was stronger now, more confident in a way that was entirely different from the brittle arrogance she had once projected. "I'm worth something because I try to help people now. Because I listen when people talk to me. Because I treat everyone with respect regardless of what they can do for me. Because I've learned that real wealth isn't about what you have, it's about who you are when nobody's watching." We talked for another 20 minutes, and I found myself genuinely liking this version of Victoria in ways I never could have imagined during our previous relationship. She was humble, without being self-deprecating, honest without being self-pitying, and thoughtful in ways that suggested genuine growth rather than performative change. When we ended the call, I sat in my study for a long time, thinking about the strange journey that had brought all of us to this point. Marcus was thriving in his marriage to Sarah, building a life based on authentic values and genuine connection. The businesses I had acquired during my campaign had become sources of community benefit and personal pride. My relationship with my son was stronger than it had ever been, built on mutual respect and honest communication. And now Victoria, the woman who had once dismissed me as irrelevant, had found her own path to genuine fulfillment and authentic success. There was a beautiful symmetry to it all, a sense that everyone had ended up exactly where they needed to be. That evening, I was once again on the deck of my yacht, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. But this time, I wasn't alone. Sarah was with me, reading a book while we waited for Marcus to return from a business dinner. We had developed our own tradition of these quiet evening conversations, where we talked about everything and nothing while the marina settled into nighttime calm. Marcus told me about Victoria's call, Sarah said, looking up from her book. How do you feel about her apology? I considered the question carefully. I feel complete, I said finally. Not because I needed her apology, but because receiving it means she genuinely learned something from our experience together. The goal was never to destroy her. It was to protect my family and to teach her that actions have consequences. If she's genuinely changed, if she's genuinely grown, if she's genuinely become a better person, then everything that happened served its purpose. Do you regret any of it? I regret that it was necessary, I said. I regret that she couldn't learn respect and humility without experiencing such painful consequences. But I don't regret protecting my son from someone who is using him, and I don't regret defending my own dignity against someone who is attacking it. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I reflected on the lessons I had learned about power, justice, and revenge. Real power, I had discovered, isn't about controlling others. It's about controlling yourself, your choices, your responses to the challenges life presents. Real justice isn't about punishment. It's about natural consequences being allowed to unfold without interference. And real revenge isn't about destruction. It's about protection, about defending what matters most and ensuring that those you love are safe from those who would harm them. The quiet victory wasn't Victoria's downfall. It was the discovery that I was strong enough to protect my family, wise enough to use my resources responsibly, and patient enough to let truth reveal itself in its own time. As I sat on my yacht that evening, surrounded by people who loved me for who I was rather than what I could give them, I realized that I had achieved something more valuable than revenge. I had achieved peace. And peace, I had learned, was worth more than all the luxury yachts and designer clothes and social status symbols in the world. It was worth everything. And that's how Anna's incredible journey of dignity, justice, and ultimate peace comes to its perfect conclusion. Not with bitterness or cruelty, but with the kind of quiet strength that comes from staying true to your values, even when others try to diminish you. Anna proved that real power isn't about what you own. It's about who you are when nobody's watching. Thank you for joining us for another powerful story on her journey. If Anna's story of quiet resilience resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't determined by how others treat them, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of strength, survival, and triumph. Remember, beautiful souls, you are worth more than how others value you. You have the power to protect what matters most to you, and sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to let others diminish your light. Until next time, keep standing in your truth, keep defending your dignity, and keep believing in your own incredible worth.